doing our first redraft on the Athletic Football Show feed today. We've been doing the show for 5 years. I don't think I've ever done this before, and I think I would have remembered based on how difficult / fun this exercise was. And part of the reason I was down to do it is that I work with Dane Brugler. Like, if we're going to do a redraft, I have the person to do the redraft with to talk about the lessons that we could learn, talk about the takeaways that we should have. I gave Dane the pick of any draft since 2011 that we could go back and redo, and you chose the 2018 draft, Dane, so that is what we are doing today.
Yeah, when you brought this up, first off, I was like, all right, this is a good way to break up my summer, considering I'm just watching Wake Forest running backs right now. This is a nice way to pivot from that a little bit, get my eyes on some actual really good football, and going through some different scenarios. But yeah, leaving it open-ended like that, where we're over a decade of sample size of different drafts, each draft's so different, and so like 2011 was so loaded in the top 10, and 2012 gave us some interesting quarterbacks with Luck and Russell Wilson, and just all those things, all those dynamics. But I went with 2018 because I think a few reasons. 17 players from the first round made at least one Pro Bowl so far. That's rare. I mean, we usually just hit rate is 50-50. So to have more than half of the first round make a Pro Bowl is saying quite a bit. I think, just the 5 quarterbacks drafted in the first round, and in a redraft, how different that order would be. And the fact that it probably wouldn't be unanimous, maybe, for everybody, just what the order of those 5 quarterbacks being redrafted would be. And then just also, it's such an interesting class for some of the non-premium positions. You could argue the best player the best player, non-quarterbacks from this draft were non-premium positions. When you're talking about the Fred Warners, the Saquons, Quentin Nelsons, and then, the best player at a premium position, non-quarterback in this draft, maybe is a guy that never played football before. He went to the NFL. So, and we'll talk a lot about that. It's a really unique class with a lot of different angles that we knew about going in. Like, if you go back to 2018 and all the different storylines, we knew a lot of all these unique different nuggets about this draft, but now in hindsight, even more so, it's really interesting.
And I think the coolest layer to this is that doing it now is different than it would have even been last summer.
100%.
And the idea that it's 7 years later and we still are gathering new information to do an exercise like this, like Sam Darnold, for example.
Exactly.
Sam Darnold, if he doesn't have the season he had last year, might not make our first round. He made both of ours. And so we have to talk about that. The way that we're talking about Baker Mayfield now compared to a couple of years ago when he was getting cut by the Panthers feels very different. And even Saquon after last season, I think you kind of have to reframe that a little bit. And then it goes the other way as well, where you have some of these guys that if we had done this exercise, let's say 2 years ago, Jair Alexander is probably like a top 10 pick in something like this. When Jair Alexander just got released and signed for a couple $1 million by the Ravens. And then you have other guys who maybe a few years ago wouldn't have been drafted as high, but they're still top players at their positions. Thinking about like Jesse Bates or DJ Reed, Carlton Davis. You kind of have to flip where some of the corners are. The tackles are really interesting based on how the last couple years have gone. The Mailata question, which you just brought up, I didn't know what to do with that. And so there are just so many different layers to this that I think are going to be really fun to dig into. The way that we're going to do this is that you're going to kind of give your picks for what you would do in a redraft. And then I'm going to throw some of my thoughts in there. And then I did this exercise as well. So I have ones that I went with, and where we really differ, I think that we can talk about why there's a little bit of a gap there and maybe dig into that a little bit. Some of these we're going to spend very little time on because I think they're pretty obvious. Some of them we'll spend a little bit more time on because there's a little bit more to chew on. So let's dig into this. Let's start with the Cleveland Browns, who had last note here. The final draft order is what we went with. I'll be honest with you. I was not going to go back and untangle all of the draft day trades and all of the moves that happened. With some of them, it is kind of silly. Like the Bills wouldn't be picking at 7 if they weren't trading up for Josh Allen. Right. So that one, maybe we could have done something about it. But I think just going with the final draft order and rolling with that made things a little bit easier for us on July 1st. So that's what we're going to go with today. So let's start with the Cleveland Browns. They actually took Baker Mayfield with the number 1 overall pick. Who would you be drafting right now in the 2018 draft with some hindsight if you were the Cleveland Browns?
Yeah, and with the benefit of hindsight, I think it comes down to the two quarterbacks, right? Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson. I went Josh Allen, who, he was rumored to be on the short list of the Browns way back then. It really was Baker Mayfield. It was Josh Allen. Sam Darnold had some love there for a little bit. This was John Dorsey, GM at that time. Hugh Jackson was the head coach, and that was a disaster. Is Josh Allen that we know today still the Josh Allen if he goes to Cleveland? Who knows? Hugh Jackson, Freddie Kitchens. Does Josh Allen survive that and still come out the other side with a Kevin Stefanski and be this superstar that we know that he is? Who knows? No one can say that. But with the benefit of hindsight, I'm taking Josh Allen there at number one.
I think you could make an argument that it works out better for Josh Allen than it might have for some of these other quarterbacks, because the situation Josh Allen was dropped into as a rookie was not good.
No.
It was very, very bad. The Rick Dennison was the offensive coordinator. He lasted 1 year there with the Bills. The pass catchers, we'll talk about that group a little bit later because the Bills have another pick in this first round. So I think that even if the Bills set him up for some success by some of the decisions they made in the coming years, he did work through some really bad situations early in his career and still worked out fine. Obviously, the work he's done on his own and just, how kind of he took control of his career in the way that he wanted it to go. I have no issue with Josh Allen at one here. I think you could absolutely pick Lamar Jackson if you wanted to. It's probably a coin flip for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume you had Lamar Jackson going at number 2 to the Giants, who originally took Saquon Barkley.
That's it. And going back to that draft, remember Dave Gettleman at the Combine saying that, okay, we're picking number 2. We want a gold jacket type of player. And so all through the process, we kind of assumed it was going to be Saquon Barkley because it felt like Eli Manning, even though he was 37 that year, still had at least 1, if not 2 years left. They were going to ride out that contract. Well, I mean, that's kind of basically how it went. And they played through 2018, and then they draft Daniel Jones the next year. But to go back in that moment, no way they're passing on Lamar Jackson at that point. He is that gold jacket type of player. So to get him at that point kind of reshapes what the Giants look like the last 7-8 years. And, it's a really fascinating what if.
These are my favorite ones because when you see teams either later in this draft or very soon after this draft making a pick that kind of rectifies a mistake they made in 2018, it's easy to do it for them. Like, you wouldn't have to draft Daniel Jones in the top 10 if you had just taken Lamar Jackson at number 2 here. And even if you want to make an argument that, well, Lamar benefited by going to the Ravens and the situation helps him. If he had gotten to sit in New York for a year behind Eli Manning, that's probably a good thing. And so you wouldn't have had to start him right away. So there's so many different things lining up where Lamar Jackson absolutely would have been the correct pick there for the Giants if the Browns did not take Josh Allen at number 1.
Yeah.
So those two.
Well, okay. I remember people saying like how wildly different Lamar Jackson's style of play is compared to Eli Manning. Well, you could say the same thing about Joe Flacco and Lamar Jackson.
Joe Flacco.
Yeah, exactly. In Baltimore, and that worked out okay. So, yeah, I think with the benefit of hindsight, this was a no-brainer, 1 and 2, whatever order you ended up having them in.
This one starts now at 3, things become a little bit interesting because you could go a bunch of different directions. So obviously at 3 in the 2018 draft, the Jets took Sam Darnold. There's an argument for Baker Mayfield here, but there's also an argument for some other players just because I don't know if Baker Mayfield survives the Jets situation in the same way that Sam Darnold struggled to survive it. So which direction did you go at 3 for the Jets after they took Sam Darnold in 2018?
I went Baker Mayfield. I mean, I think this is a Jets team still searching for a quarterback. I mean, it's and you have to kind of take your shot. And Baker, what he did, because he survived the Cleveland debacle with Hugh Jackson and then Freddie Kitchens, and first year with Kevin Stefanski, he leads Browns to a playoff win. So it's something that it feels like Baker Mayfield has reinvented himself quite a few times now in the NFL, and he probably would have had to do that with the Jets. And no, I mean he might not still be on the Jets if they drafted him in that draft. Who knows? But I'm at least rolling the dice that he's able to figure things out, and you have a quarterback in New York that can be the guy, something they haven't had for quite a while. So I did go Baker Mayfield there at 3, but it's not like it was a slam dunk where it is no-brainer like the first 2 picks.
First two picks are easy. This one's a little bit more difficult. The first what if that I think is worth asking. What if the Browns just never traded Baker Mayfield?
Yeah.
I think that's a conversation that we should probably revisit at some point because we would just think so much differently about the Browns and they would be in such a different position right now. I just feel like they'd be one of the better stories in the entire league if they had just kept rolling with Baker Mayfield. Because even if you had to pay Baker Mayfield at the end of
Oh
his
my
rookie deal, you wouldn't have had to
avoiding
pay what
yeah,
you did for Deshaun Watson and the
exactly.
draft picks. It's just the
Exactly.
Browns would be in such a different position. And then in the moment, they made that move thinking Baker Mayfield limits our ceiling. Deshaun Watson gives us an unlimited ceiling, not considering what the floor for both of those players looked like. And so that's a fascinating what if that I think is probably worth re-examining in a little bit more depth at some point. I did not go with Baker Mayfield to the Jets for this reason. I just have so many horrific memories of Sam Darnold behind that offensive line with the Jets that part of me just wanted to atone for what those teams felt like in New York. And so I was just so tempted to just throw an offensive tackle on this team. Kelvin Beachum was kind of like a mild stopgap left tackle for the Jets at that point, and then Brandon Shell was the right tackle. And so you can make an argument for a bunch of different tackles here. I think they're all kind of grouped together in the non-Jordan Mailata tier, which we'll get to a little bit later. But Colton Miller, Brian O'Neill, Orlando Brown Jr. Like if you're stacking up just starting tackles in the league, they're probably all grouped similarly. I went with Colton Miller just because if you put him on the right side for a year, he could probably move to the left side. He's shown an ability to do that, and he's just a more than capable left tackle, which are hard to find. But I could see you going with a couple different tackles here, and I could see you going with the guy that we both had at 4, which I think is a little bit easier to land on. So the Browns at 4 in the original draft went with Denzel Ward. Who did you have them picking here in the redraft?
So I really considered Denzel Ward here. I think it really came down to 2 players for me, Denzel Ward and Fred Warner. I ended up going Fred Warner. You can make the argument he's the best non-quarterback that come out of this draft class, even though he does play a quote-unquote non-premium position, a linebacker who isn't going to give you a ton of blitzing as a pass rusher. At least that's not his forte. But the way he impacts the entire defense in coverage, snap to snap, he's still doing it at a high level to this day. So for the Browns, Josh Allen at 1, Fred Warner at 4, you're coming away from that draft thinking you just got 2 pillars on both sides of the ball. So I really that made me lean towards Warner over the chalk pick, which actually happened with Denzel Ward.
The linebacker consideration in the top 5, typically, part of the reason that it's a scary proposition to draft a linebacker high in the first round or in the first round at all is that it's a really difficult position to project moving forward. Like that's part of the downside is that we don't really know which linebacker traits are always going to translate. That and safety, I think that there's just a lot of murkiness in projecting guys to the next level. Well, if you know a guy's going to be a Hall of Fame player at that position, the impact is still there. And so
Right.
all of that uncertainty gets wiped away in an exercise like this. And I think it's very easy to plug Fred Warner into there. And one of the other considerations with Warner is that a lot of these guys, even players in the first round of this draft, we're going to get to injury concerns. We're going to get to just vacillations in play over the last 7 or so years. With Warner, there's been none of that. He started 115 games in 7 years. He's been one of the most reliable players in the league, along with being the best player at his position. So this was a pretty easy one for me. And again, I think the only reason I didn't have him go at 3 to the Jets is just because I have those memories of those Jets offensive lines and Sam Darnold behind them in my head, and I just don't want to live like that anymore.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And like I said, this is a weird draft because there's no Myles Garrett, there's no Nick Bosa, there's no Malik Neighbors where the receiver, edge rusher, like there's not that one guy where it's clearly okay, this is the top non-quarterback, this is the direction you should go. Yeah, I mean, for everything that you said with Fred Warner, kind of is the reason why the next pick at number 5 with the Broncos, I went Saquon Barkley. It's, running back is a position where, yes, you can find it later on. There's going to be a lot of running backs in every draft, but when you know exactly the type of player you're getting, and we had a good idea before the draft. That's why he was the second overall pick, how talented he was, how gifted of an athlete. But seeing what we've seen with him in the NFL, the impact that he makes, especially this past year in Philly, going to Denver at 5, a team that needed a quarterback. I mean, I know this has been said before many times, but it's just amazing that Elway didn't draft Josh Allen at 5. I mean, it's just, and I know Elway has called it the biggest mistake of his GM tenure, but it's just in hindsight, especially in hindsight, but even in the moment, it was kind of surprising that that was his type of quarterback, and they needed a quarterback at that time. So, I don't know, just surprising. But in this situation with the 3 quarterbacks off the board, I ended up going Saquon Barkley there at 5.
Well, so you understand how it happens though, right? Because looking back on it, it's so easy to say that where it's like, man, I cannot believe they did not draft Josh Allen there. Well, they were just coming off of the Paxton Lynch experience after drafting Paxton Lynch in the first round.
Scar tissue.
And
yeah.
They signed Case Keenum that offseason to one of those veteran quarterback deals that has never worked out ever.
Yeah.
Like guys who are sort of career backups that have that one flash season where they play really well and then get rewarded in free agency. I'm sure there's some example hiding out there that I'm not thinking of, but guys like the Nick Foles contract in Jacksonville, the Case Keenum contract here, the Mike Glennon deal. He didn't even play well to get that deal, but like any sort of contract like that, I think the history of those is very bad. But I think they just wanted some sort of stability and certainty. And so they signed Case Keenum in free agency that year coming off the Paxton Lynch thing, and they didn't need a quarterback because they had just paid one like $18 million a year. We all know how that worked out. The next year, they were on the same train doing it with Joe Flacco. So finding a quarterback here, I think, was the priority for me as I went back to do it. And in my version of this, Baker Mayfield is still available. So it was very easy for me to just drop Baker Mayfield onto the Broncos and kind of correct their quarterback issues. What was it? 6 years before they eventually did it.
Right. Yeah. And it's fascinating because, and that's the intrigue with the draft, because you have to learn from your draft mistakes, no doubt about it. You have to learn from everything. But at the same time, you can't let past mistakes dictate the way you draft moving forward, So it's a fine line to walk because you have to learn from it, but at the same time, you can't let it overly influence the way you do business moving forward. So yeah, they just, you're right. They went the complete opposite end of the spectrum. And of course it didn't work out either way. And the answer was sitting in front of them the whole time. But yeah, that's an interesting what if in Broncos history, no doubt.
Let's get to the Colts at 6 in the original draft. They took Quentin Nelson. I was very tempted to just have them do the same thing all over again because Quentin Nelson has been a very, very good player. What did you do for the Colts at number 6?
That's exactly what I did. Quentin Nelson's been just a rock solid player. And again, we talked about, think about the first 3 non-quarterbacks drafted. We've got a linebacker, a running back, and now a guard. Like, it's really fascinating the way that has played out for me in my order. We can argue about, whether you can find guards later and all of that. Nelson's just been and I know maybe every season hasn't been an all-pro season, but he's been above average since he's been in the league, and he still has plenty of really good seasons left.
We're paying guards $25 million a year now.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's okay if you feel like you have a Pro Bowl caliber guard for a decade to plug him in at number 6 overall in this draft. And it was, I think for me here, you probably could throw Saquon Barkley in here just because I haven't had him go off the board yet. But this is a conversation about running backs and about what you need to do for running backs. Saquon Barkley, without that season last year with the Eagles, do you think we'd be talking about Saquon Barkley in the top 5 of a redraft like this? I don't know if we would.
Probably
necessarily.
Not. Yeah.
And I think that speaks to how important a situation is for running backs. I mean, Saquon is such an example of what happens when you take a guy from an awful spot to a really good one and what he's capable of. I still feel like there's so many components necessary for all of that to line up that it's tempting for me just to take a guy like Quentin Nelson, who I know can be whatever he's going to be independent of anything else you put around him. So I think that's why it was kind of easy for me to just throw Quentin Nelson back on the Colts and save Saquon for a little bit further down the draft. I also just, with some of these, it was just fun to have the team take the same player. It's like, oh, this works out really well. I'll just have him do this again. And then the next couple picks, there are also, I made some decisions based on what I enjoyed as part of the exercise. In these coin flip moments, I think that you have to entertain yourself as much as anything. So we both had Quentin Nelson going at 6 to the Colts. Who did you have going at 7 to the Buffalo Bills? Again, acknowledging that they probably wouldn't be drafting here if they didn't trade up for Josh Allen.
I had him going with Denzel Ward, who he could have gone any of the first or these last 3 spots. I think he has been a top 7 corner in the league for some time now. If not for the injuries, we'd be talking about him even more. So when he's healthy and on the field, he is one of the best in the NFL at a position that's very hard to play. So a premium position, I'm getting him at number 7. If I'm the Bills. I'm feeling pretty good about that.
Yeah, you absolutely could make the argument for that. Levi Wallace started 7 games across from Tre'Davious White for that 2018 Bills team. There's a lot of safeties in this draft, and I had to say Bills passed on safety twice because they had Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer already in 2018 because they had signed them both the previous year in free agency. So I totally understand the Denzel Ward point. Denzel Ward is the one guy that I feel guilty about how late I have him going in this exercise. You can make an argument for every pick that I made in front of Denzel Ward, but I already feel bad that I had him going as late as I did. I had them picking Roquan Smith, and it's for this reason. They picked Tremaine Edmonds later in the first round in this draft, so they clearly wanted an off-ball linebacker to come out of this draft, and I just think that Roquan Smith has been so good when he's been in the right situations in the league, and it's very easy for me to imagine Roquan Smith being even an upgrade from what Tremaine Edmonds had been for the Bills before he walked in free agency. So the fact that they were sniffing around a position like that anyway, and Roquan Smith has been as good as he has over the course of his career, that's why I went that way instead of going with somebody like Denzel Ward, just because I know they already wanted a guy at that spot.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense because, like you said, Buffalo had a pick later in mid-first round. That's a position that they targeted there. Roquan, he was a top 10 linebacker. He played like it for the majority of his career. I think it's, again, we're talking about premium positions and where do you draft these guys? But with the benefit of hindsight and understanding the impact that they will make, it takes some of the guesswork out of it. And so know the type of player you're getting. And so that changes the conversation a little bit when you're doing an exercise like this.
I absolutely could have thrown Saquon on that Bills team as well instead of Roquan Smith. Part of the reason that I didn't is that it would have been too tempting to put Roquan Smith back on the Bears, and I found that boring. And so that was also part of the reason why I just put Roquan Smith on the Bills and allowed the Bears to maybe go a different direction at 8. So they did take Roquan Smith in 2018. What did you have the Bears doing in the redraft for what they did with the 8th overall pick here?
So this is where it gets interesting for me. I went with Jordan Mailata, and look, this is a tough one because the Bears didn't have an immediate need at tackle necessarily at 2018. I mean, Charles Leno was a fine B option at that time, and I think he can continue to play for the Bears another 3 years. So it wasn't like the next year there was going to be an opening. Right tackle, a little bit of a different question or a different situation. Bobby Massey, and they could have needed a right tackle, but when you look at Jordan Mailata, he's fascinating in an exercise like this because you have to understand, you have to almost redshirt him for 2 years. This is a guy who didn't play football. Coming over from rugby, has no college football experience. He barely played. He really didn't play his first 2 years, so he redshirts. But if you know that, maybe not know, but if you feel good about his chances of starting in year 3, a top 15 offensive tackle by year 4, and then by year 6, we're talking about him as maybe a top 5 offensive tackle. And so even though it's a long process and not every GM is going to be up for that, but thinking about what he's going to be, even though it's a little bit of a slow burn, I think that's tough to pass on. And so, but this is a fascinating conversation with Mailata because, again, it's like you have to wait it out. There's a little bit of some trepidation in there because, yes, he went to Philly where, Stoutland you and he got certain development. Like if he goes anywhere else, who knows how that plays out. So development is not a guarantee, but I still think that when you think you have a player that could be a top 5 offensive tackle in the league by year 6, that's something worth investing in, even if it's as early as the top 10.
I didn't know what to do with him because you probably could have put him at 3 to the Jets if you were considering that development path where he is a top 5 left tackle by year 5 or 6. I had him going at 13 to Washington, and it was for this reason. Washington had Trent Williams at the time. So if there's one spot where he wouldn't have been an immediate starter, he would have gotten to sit, he would have had some time, Washington is probably the easiest place to project that. And to me, it felt like splitting the difference, where we're not putting him in the top 5, but we're also not putting him lower than a guy of his caliber should be going. So I think that it just felt like the natural point to me where it's like, okay, now we're kind of accounting for the development curve. We're accounting for the players who are already there. And this feels like a natural landing spot for him. But of every single player in this exercise, I think he was the hardest to find an appropriate landing spot for just because of all of the context that you're having to work through.
There's not many GMs in a league that are going to draft a player knowing that they're not going to get really much out of them for 2 years. That's a hard pill to swallow. That's a hard sell to the fan base. But we're doing this exercise with the benefit of hindsight where, we can, say, it's an option that maybe some teams should have gone down that road, and you see how it pays off. The Bears are one of those teams where I think, you're picking top 10 for a reason. As much as I liked Roquan Smith and some of these other options, you could have gone another offensive lineman, whether it's Brian O'Neill or one of these other guys. I don't know. I still went with the long game, but I certainly understand if going in a different direction there.
Saquon's still on the board for me, so it was very easy for me to drop Saquon on the Bears here at 8. And again, kind of thinking about, all right, where would Saquon be successful? Where would he look more like Saquon Barkley? For as much as a mess as the Bears were over these couple years, picking in the top 10, obviously, in 2017 into 2018, that offensive line wasn't terrible. Like, it actually was a solid group. You alluded to Charles Leno, Bobby Massey. They had Kyle Long still at that point. Cody Whitehair was a rookie playing center. And then they also had Cody Whitehair was the center. And then they had James Daniels as a rookie at one of those guard spots. And so to me, dropping Saquon into that situation, I think that's probably better than a lot of the teams he played with in New York. And I think that we could have seen at least a decent version of Saquon Barkley behind that offensive line. I mean, think about it. Jordan Howard was productive behind that offensive line. So I think a back like Saquon Barkley, that one's easy for me to picture. And again, it was just more fun to put Saquon Barkley on the Bears and Roquan Smith on the Bills rather than just throwing Roquan Smith back on the Bears.
Yeah, that is 100% true. Jordan Howard, he didn't last in the NFL very much longer after that. And so thinking about what he could have been and how that would have maybe helped out Trubisky and the quarterback situation, that's also kind of a what if. And having a dynamic running back like that, how that affects the rest of the offense, that would have been interesting.
Jordan Howard, I just looked at the numbers. It was shocking even like in retrospect. Jordan Howard rushed for 1,300 yards as a rookie.
Yeah, he was outstanding out of Indiana. Had that UAB transfer, had that great rookie year. It was third round pick.
No, right? It was further down than that. He was a 5th round pick.
Oh wow!
So he went in the 5th round, which even in the moment felt like he probably went a little bit too late. So, but as a rookie, he had 252 carries for 1,300 yards, and then in his second year, he had 275 carries for 1,100 yards. So combined, his first 2 seasons, he had 2,400 rushing yards. So again, drop Saquon Barkley into that situation instead of Jordan Howard, and I think it's pretty easy to get excited about what that would have looked like.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. And that's the fact that you can get Jordan Howard that late and give you that type of production is kind of what we're talking about with the running back position. And, you can find some of these guys later on. He's a great example of that.
Let's get to the Niners at number 9. They took Mike McGlinchey in the actual draft in 2018 at right tackle. What did you have the Niners doing in the redraft here?
So I'm going Brian O'Neill from out of Pitt. He was a second-round pick to the Vikings, turned out to be a very good player. And this is, like you mentioned, instead of Mike McGlinchey, who I still have later on in this first round, but looking back, couldn't put him as high as the top 10, where Brian O'Neill, I think, has, he was a little bit of a projection coming out, former tight end, athletic, moves well, but there's projection involved. That's why he didn't go until the late second when he did. But looking back, I think the development path that he was on, you can be pretty excited about that. So had him going 9 to the 49ers.
I just think he's been a little bit better in pass protection over the course of his career than McGlinchey has been.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I give him the nod. And I also had Brian O'Neill going here. It was very easy considering they needed a right tackle, and he's probably the best right tackle to come out of this group. You can make an argument for Orlando Brown Jr. as well, but stylistically, just think about what the Niners offense was back then. Still more athleticism, more outside zone. And so it just would be hard for me to drop a player like Orlando Brown Jr., who really has succeeded in gap schemes for most of his career, into a situation like the Niners. So I think the Brian O'Neill one was pretty easy for me. Couple other fun ones I would throw out for you. Imagine DJ Moore in like the Deebo Samuel role in that Niners offense.
Sure. Yeah. Because, that 2018 49ers offense, who's their leading receiver?
So now looking at this group, it's much easier. Maybe DJ Moore is actually the pick. So George Kittle had 88 catches that year for the Niners on 136 targets. This is crazy. So George Kittle had 136 targets that year. The second leading target getter on the 2018 Niners was Kendrick Bourne, who had 66.
Oh, gosh.
So George Kittle had twice the targets that any other receiver on the 2018 Niners got.
Well, and Nick Mullins led that team in passing. So, CJ Beathard, Garoppolo only played 3 games that year. Oh, man.
Well, that's a sneaky big year for the Niners because you remember this. Like Garoppolo played so well down the back half of the season in 2018. He gets that monster contract, and their Niners have pretty decent expectations going into the next year. He gets hurt. They go 4-12, and it ends up becoming the best thing for them because they draft Nick Bosa with the second overall pick the next year.
Right, exactly. And so they kind of, because Shanahan, he had, was 2018 his first year?
Second year.
2017
was his first year. That was the year where they kind of had Hoyer and Beathard, and they pieced it all together, and then they traded for Garoppolo halfway through the season.
Yeah, I think you're right. DJ Moore, thinking about this, I almost went Roquan Smith there at 9, where kind of, because we had Fred Warner obviously going before they could draft him in the 3rd round. So to get Roquan Smith there at 9 would make sense. But yeah, one of these pass catchers, man, that would certainly change a lot compared to what they had.
I'm still fine going with Brian O'Neill, but I think the DJ Moore thing, as I look at the wide receiver depth chart, becomes a little bit tempting. The other guy I'd throw out, because I haven't had him go yet, is Denzel Ward. Because Akello Weatherspoon is the other outside corner on this team after they signed Richard Sherman. And so I think you can make the argument for Denzel Ward. Frank Ragnow is a name I would throw out there just because of how good Frank Ragnow was. But this team had just signed Weston Richburg at center in free agency that year. So they had already had their guy that they were really committed to. So I feel good about Brian O'Neill, but maybe it's just because of what those Niners teams turned into that it's tempting to think about a few other guys that you could throw into the mix there.
Weston Richburg, a name I haven't heard in a long time. He was one of the
best
prizes
part of stuff like this.
Yeah, well, he was one of the prizes that free agency offseason. That's crazy. Well, I mean, speaking of Frank Ragnow, that's who I have going next at 10.
Same.
You think of that Cardinals offensive line was because 2018 was that Sam Bradford? Is there a quarterback going for the Cardinals going into that year? So I believe so.
Well, they drafted Josh Rosen. Josh Rosen started 13 games that year. So they had Sam Bradford originally, but yes. So they had Josh Rosen, and he played that season.
That's
So if you look at the offensive line, there are some tackles available, but this is a team that, for as bad as they were, actually had some answers at tackle. Like DJ Humphries was 25 years old, a left tackle on this team. They had Andre Smith and Mason Cole. It started 16 games for them at center after being drafted in the middle rounds. So it was very easy to just throw Frank Ragnow in there as an upgrade over what Mason Cole ultimately gave them, because I did the same thing.
Well, and Ragnow, he started at guard his entire rookie year for the Lions. So, I mean, you had some flexibility in the middle there where center, guard, you're just getting a rock solid player for the next, even though, the end came a little bit sooner than you want for a guy that you're drafting in 2018, just coming off his retirement this offseason. He was so good over his career that you can absolutely make the argument that he belongs in the top 10.
Yeah, you could try to make a case here for somebody like DJ Moore. He has not gone for either one of us, but they
Right.
still had Larry Fitzgerald. They actually drafted Christian Kirk that year, but it's just too
Hmm.
tempting to have like rock solid. I think is the exact way to frame it with Ragnow, where you drop in the middle of that offensive line and just kind of completely remakes that group over the next few years. Where I think the Cardinals during this stretch kind of struggle to figure out who they wanted their offensive line to be. And think about it, they eventually traded for Rodney Hudson because they had to, because they couldn't
Right.
find an answer at this spot. So I think
Right.
giving them Ragnow and a little bit of certainty is a worthwhile move here. Who'd you have going to Miami at 11? They took Minkah Fitzpatrick, obviously, in the actual draft, which we could do an hour on all of that and the fact that he's now back in Miami. But what did you have them doing with the benefit of a little bit of hindsight here?
I went Orlando Brown Jr. You think about that offensive line, what it's been the last 7, 8 years. 2018 was Juwan James last year in Miami. So you draft Orlando Brown
Man,
this year. You could play him at guard maybe in 2018. He's ready to step in at right tackle at 2019. You don't have to draft Austin Jackson 2 years later in the first round. So adding an offensive lineman like that you can play multiple different spots in the offensive line moving forward, I thought made some sense.
you forget how rough those offensive lines were for Miami, especially after
Oh
the
yeah.
Tunsil trade. The Miami's starting offensive line, the players who started the most games at these positions on the offensive line in 2019, Julian Davenport at left tackle, Michael Dieter at left guard, Daniel Kilgore at center, Shaq Calhoun at right guard, and Jesse Davis at right tackle. I think Orlando
Jeez.
Brown might have worked his way into the starting lineup for the Miami Dolphins that year.
Yeah, it would not have taken very long for him to move up that depth chart at multiple different positions. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting how many offensive linemen we've been talking about already. It just kind of speaks to the league as a whole, where if you don't have offensive line, yeah, you need to go invest in that position early. And I know in mine alone, I have 4 in a row right here, 8, 9, 10, 11, all offensive linemen. So yeah, it's a position where even if like there might be a B plus at another position, but if you can get a B minus on the offensive line, you're gonna value that a little bit more, just because of
I
what the scarcity of finding those guys.
I'm so glad you said that because it's exactly how my brain was working as I was going back through this, where anytime there was like a tiebreaker necessary, I was like, I'd rather just take the offensive lineman and have it. I'd rather
Yeah.
just know that I'm solid there. I mean, that is how Colton Miller goes third overall to the Jets, where it's like, I know this isn't fun or exciting, but just think about what it's like living in the tackle wilderness and having an answer that even as unexciting as Colton Miller is, it just makes your life so much easier and just lessens your anxiety to such a degree that's why I think it's easy to throw offensive linemen on all of these different teams. That being said, I know I read off the starters on the offensive line for the 2019 Jets and why it was justifiable to take a tackle there. I would like to read off to you the production for the 2018 Miami Dolphins wide receivers. Okay?
Gosh.
Ready? Here we go. The leading target getter on the 2018 Dolphins was Danny Amendola. He had 79 targets for 575 yards.
Oh man.
Next up, Kenny Stills, 37 catches, 553 yards. Next up, Albert Wilson, 26 catches for 391 yards. This was post Jarvis Landry trade, I believe. He was
Okay.
already on the Browns at this point. So this was a tough situation for the pass catching group in Miami. Devontae Parker was there. He had 24 catches. It was easy for me to throw DJ Moore onto this team. As bad
Well,
as the offensive line situation was, I think the receiver situation warranted a little bit of help here.
and this is still Tannehill, right? So
This is still Tannehill. Yes.
yeah. Oh god, he had no chance. And then what? Adam Gase. So yeah, that was a disaster waiting to happen. No wonder why they were picking so high in the draft.
And then the next year, obviously, they trade Tannehill. They go with Ryan Fitzpatrick, and that's when the tank begins with Brian Flores in 2019.
Right.
But yeah, putting DJ Moore on this team with that group, that was easy for me to do. But I think the offensive line is also very justifiable considering the state of it. There's a reason that this team started tearing it down the following year. There was not a lot to work with.
Tank
number
for Tua
12
became a thing. Yeah.
Yes. And so the fact that team was tank ready, you could go a bunch of different directions with that pick, I think, and make an easy argument for it. At number 12, the Bucs took Vita Vea in this draft. Who did you have the Bucs going with in the redraft?
So I had them doing exactly that with Vita Vea. And I think there are certainly different directions they could have gone. There's still good players available here, but I'd say it's worked out okay with Vita Vea, with what he's meant for that defense over the years. And so why not just kind of a lot of the things we said about Quentin Nelson still going at 6 to the Colts, kind of copy and paste right here, 12 to the Buccaneers.
This is a hard one because you could go a bunch of different directions. Like Denzel Ward is still available for me here. Minkah Fitzpatrick is still available. I think you could do that. I expected them to take Derwin James in this draft because of the holes that they had at safety. Part of the reason that I also put Vita Vea back on the Bucs, they won a Super Bowl like 2 years later. And part of me is just like, if it ain't broke, like all the stuff that they did, let's just keep doing it because it worked out just fine for them. Even if you could probably make an argument there are more valuable players available at positions of need for them here.
Yep, exactly.
Washington at 13. They took Daron Payne in the actual draft in 2018. I already mentioned that I had Jordan Mailata going here. What did you have Washington doing at 13?
This is where I had Roquan Smith going. 13, maybe a little bit later than he should go. But again, we're still talking about a linebacker. Not everyone's going to take a linebacker that early. But knowing what type of pro he has been, and you look at Washington, they kind of ignored the linebacker position for a while there. 2018, their starters were Mason Foster and Zach Brown. And that really led to the Jamin Davis pick in the first round a couple years later, which obviously did not work out. So to get Roquan Smith here for the middle of that defense, I think would help them quite a bit on that side of the ball.
You look at the following year, they drafted Cole Holcomb, and he started 15 games for them in 2019.
He was like
Jonathan
a fifth rounder, right?
Yeah, later in the draft. And then they got Jonathan Bostic from the Bears, and he started 16 games for them in 2019. That is the first of 2 times that Jonathan Bostic is going to come up on this podcast, by the way. So I think Roquan Smith going there makes a ton of sense. Again, I had Mailata there. This is the first point in this draft where I think you could throw Sam Darnold's name out there.
Yeah. Sam Darnold's fascinating to talk about in this scenario because you're 100% right. A year ago, how we talk about him. 2 years ago, how we talk about him. Now, how we're talking about him. A year from now, how are we going to talk about? It's really a moving target, but for some of these teams, we both have them going in this first round. So we've kind of already said that, but I think you're right. This is where you start to have those conversations about, all right, in this situation, how is that career trajectory different for the better, hopefully. That's interesting.
Sam Darnold, I think you could make an argument at 13 for Washington. Yeah. I think you could make an argument at 14 for the Saints. Knowing that Drew Brees was coming to the end, they probably should have drafted a succession plan sooner than they did. So these are 2 spots where I think you could easily make a Sam Darnold argument. After this, I think the only other team that really comes up in the middle of the draft is probably the Bills. Because in this exercise, they wouldn't have taken Josh Allen. And so I think you could probably throw Sam Darnold onto their team at 16. But think about all the other teams after that. The Raiders at 15, they have Derek Carr. They had just made Derek Carr one of the highest paid quarterbacks in the league. Phillip Rivers was still playing really well for the Chargers and still a couple years before he was done. Aaron Rodgers for the Packers, Dak Prescott for the Cowboys, Matthew Stafford for the Lions. You could probably give the Bengals a quarterback, but again, I don't want to mess with the Joe Burrow juju here, and so I didn't want to do that. Tennessee had drafted Mariota, and so they already have a quarterback, and then they eventually went to get Tannehill a little bit later on. So maybe you can make an argument for that, but
they drafted him in 15. So
15.
Yeah, so
and it was
probably enough time.
It's easier to justify a 4th-round pick for Ryan Tannehill than it is trading or using another first-round pick on a quarterback. The Patriots maybe with Brady, but I still feel like he had, a couple years left. And then a lot of these other teams we'll get to, but I think that Saints and Washington at 13 are two of the most intriguing Darnold spots in the middle of this draft.
Him with Sean Payton is interesting.
Yes.
How that would play out. Man, that would have been really interesting because he wouldn't have been thrown into the mix right away. Could have kind of brought him along at his own pace. We know the year before that Peyton wanted to trade up for Patrick Mahomes. So to get Darnold here at 14, that would be a really interesting what if, what that version of the Saints would have looked like. That's fascinating.
That one's tempting. That is not what I did. Who did you ultimately give to the Saints at 14?
So I went Minkah Fitzpatrick for that secondary, and
it's just so fun. I did the same thing. It's
Yes.
so fun to think about.
Right. And it's interesting that, I mean, just going back, the Saints, remember them trading up, and I remember when in the moment when that happened, you see the Saints pop up at the bottom of the screen, big trade. It's like, okay, they traded a future one to go up to the middle of the first round. This is Lamar Jackson. They're going to get Lamar Jackson. We know that they wanted to get Mahomes the year before. We know Brees is towards the end. We just talked about that. They're going up to get Lamar Jackson, and then Marcus Davenport comes across the screen. It's like that was one of the core memories that I'll have of this draft, was that big swing on a draft that didn't have a lot of pass rushers, and they kind of swung on a toolsy one. That one was kind of crazy. But yeah, so I went with Minkah Fitzpatrick, who has been, I think it's interesting, some of the discourse with Fitzpatrick the last 24 hours after leaving the Steelers, and whether or not he's lived up to the contract, whether or not he was a great fit for what they were doing. He's still a really good player. And so I think you put him in that back end of that defense, and the Saints have they probably get a little bit more out of that final run with Peyton and Brees.
Yeah, and I think that what Dennis Allen was able to do with that defense over multiple years, it's a good situation, and it's just so tempting to imagine him next to Marcus Williams. Like those two guys next to each other with Marshawn Lattimore in that same secondary, with Demario Davis, Cam Jordan still there. That was one of the easiest ones for me. Just stylistically, everything about Minkah Fitzpatrick on those Saints teams was very fun to imagine. All right, let's get to the Raiders at 15. They took Colton Miller in the actual draft. I had Colton Miller coming off the board earlier. What did you have the Raiders doing in this redraft?
I had him going Colton Miller, sticking with what worked. And I was one of the big doubters on this pick. Colton Miller was a really inconsistent player at UCLA. It was a bet on traits and what he was going to grow into, and I just felt like a big swing to take there in the top 15. But he has been more than a rock solid player. He is kind of the ceiling that we thought he could have. He has achieved that, and I think is. You could probably say he probably has another year or two of still getting better to go. So he's been a really good player and could have easily gone before the 15th pick.
Yeah, I had him going earlier than this, but I think that this is probably the right spot based on everything else that you've done. And you had Denzel Ward going early. I had Colton Miller going early. I had Denzel Ward here because he's still on the board for me. And just the Raiders, think about what a nightmare those cornerback spots have been or were for such a long time. Gary and Conley or Daryl Worley. I mean, just they really have struggled to find Damon Arnett. And so this to me was just a way to right some of those wrongs with Denzel Ward still sitting on the board here, is that you stop the revolving door, you have an answer. He probably shouldn't be available here. And I'm sure I made a mistake in not having him go earlier on in this exercise, but this was an easy one for me with Denzel Ward still available.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about best available. Yeah, he's best available is no doubt about it at this point.
Let's get to the Bills at 16. In the actual draft, they took Tremaine Edmonds, the linebacker. Who did you have them going with here at 16?
So we talked a little bit before how the Bills, that offense, regardless of who was at quarterback, they had some big questions at pass catcher. And so this is where I had the first receiver coming off the board, DJ Moore. Zay Jones led that offense in catches in 2018. Do you know who was second?
Robert Foster, right?
LaShawn McCoy.
Oh, it was LaShawn
Uh,
McCoy.
yeah.
They're like Robert Foster was a starting receiver on that team.
He was, yeah. It was looking at that offense, it was rough. The pass catchers, the skill players. So yeah, you drop DJ Moore into there. We still don't know who's the quarterback of the future. So I think this is definitely a Sam Darnold possibility, but the chance to get the top receiver in the draft, I think that would have made sense for that Bills team.
My thinking was along similar lines. I had them taking Mark Andrews. Just
Mm,
give me any sort of pass catcher. And for me,
sure.
DJ Moore is off the board. And so anybody I mean, Josh Allen wouldn't be there. Whoever the quarterback was, Tyrod Taylor, anybody, just give me
Yeah.
somebody to throw the ball to. And I think Mark Andrews, and again, tight ends, it's checkered development history. It's hard to figure out which guys are going to be successful, but we know Mark Andrews has turned into a very, very good pass catching tight end. So I think it's pretty justifiable in this spot. A couple other guys I was thinking about, Daron Payne. Kyle Williams was in the final year of his deal here. So, they had just signed Star Lotulelei in free agency, but there's a reason they take Ed Oliver shortly after this because they eventually did have a need at defensive tackle. And then this is the first time with LaShawn McCoy in the final year of his deal in Buffalo, I think you could mention Nick Chubb's name here. Like if they had taken Nick Chubb in this spot, I would have no issues with that whatsoever.
100%. This is around the range where, I was thinking about Nick Chubb as well. I mean, I knew going into this exercise I was going to have two running backs. We had a lot of running backs drafted that year in the top 4 rounds. There's only 2 that I knew were going to be in there without a doubt, Barkley and then Chubb somewhere else. So, yeah, I think that would have made sense there at 16 for Nick Chubb.
Let's go with the Chargers at 17. The actual draft, they took Derwin James. Who did you have the Chargers going with?
So I went with Jesse Bates, kind of maybe a more consistent version. I mean, I know they're different with how they play, but obviously we know they wanted to get better at safety, and Jesse Bates has just been a more consistent player so far in the NFL in terms of healthier, should put it that way as well.
I have no issue with that at all. I went with Orlando Brown Jr. because he was available for me here, and I just remember what that right tackle spot was for the Chargers for a very long time at this point. I mean,
so it's Phillip Rivers.
Trey Pipkins gave them like some decent play, at times over the last few years. But before it was Trey Pipkins, do you remember who the starting right tackle was for the Chargers in 2018?
Gosh, remind me.
It was Sam Tevy. Sam Tevy had 2 years as the Chargers right tackle. So this one was easy for me. As somebody who was watching those Chargers teams with like some real intent, being able to go back in time and fix the right tackle situation, this was a no-brainer for me.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Packers at 18. They took Jair Alexander in the actual draft. Who'd you have them taking here?
So I had them going with Josh Sweat, who...
Interesting. The first player who did not make my first round.
Okay, yeah. So he obviously cashed in at the right time this past year. Had best year of his career, cashed in. It's funny, I know a lot of Packers fans were clamoring to spend some of that Banks money on Josh Sweat instead. But you look back at that 2018 Packers defense. I believe that was Mike Pettin, Clay Matthews, Nick Perry. I mean, those are your starting pass rushers. They were both gone after 2018. So
that's Josh a good point.
Sweat in that mix where he's part of the rotation, ready to be a starter by 2019. I think he fits a lot of honestly, it came down between him and Daron Payne. We know what the Packers look for in the first round of the draft. Jair Alexander, who they actually drafted, was a little bit of maybe different than what they usually go for, but I think Sweat is kind of in their lane for a type of guy that would have maybe not as the testing, maybe, I don't know, but based on what he's done the last 7 years, I think that it would have made sense for the Packers.
He was a good tester and he's long. I mean, I can understand they're buying into the physical traits. It's also funny because that next offseason is the offseason where they spent a load of money on edge rushers. They spent for Zadarius Smith that offseason. They spent for Preston Smith. And so this maybe prevents them from having to do that. So I get that one. For me, I put Derwin James here to the Packers at 18 just because the spine of those defenses was a nightmare for like years. So even if it's been up and down for Derwin James, just giving them some answer at safety, even like as a dime linebacker, some of the things he could have done for this team and some of the issues they had at those spots. Derwin's a tough one too, just because the highs have obviously been so high, but some injury concerns and it's been a little bit up and down. But for where that Packers team was, trying to give them like some new version of what Charles Woodson has been for them, that was tempting for me here.
Yeah, and I've got Derwin James going here a few picks after this, so kind of around the same range I was looking.
Dallas Cowboys at 19 went with Leighton Vander Esch in the actual draft. Who did you have them going with here?
Yeah, I was tempted to go receiver, Calvin Ridley, maybe. CeeDee Lamb's not there yet. They're Amari Cooper's gone, I believe at this point. So like they really could have gone for a receiver for Dak Prescott. But I like you said with Joe Burrow, I didn't want to mess up that CeeDee Lamb vibes. So I went with Tremaine Edmonds. We know they actually went Leighton Vander Esch, who is a really good player. It's just, he couldn't stay healthy. Injuries ended his career before we had a chance to really see him shine. So thought about receiver here, ended up going with the linebacker that we know they coveted for that defense.
I went with Daron Payne. So again, just addressing the spine of the defense. Antoine Woods played a ton of snaps for this team that year, along with Malik Collins. Like those were their two starting tackles. I was tempted to throw Jesse Bates in here as well, but they already had Xavier Woods. Jeff Heath was the other safety on that team. So I think you probably could have gone with Jesse Bates, but just one interior pass rusher for this team based on the makeup of that group. That's why I ultimately went with Payne instead of the other guys.
I almost went Derwin James because I know the Cowboys fans really wanted Derwin James in that draft, and he didn't make it to him. He went 2 picks before, but it was still available in this scenario, so that was a hard consideration as well.
Number 20, the Detroit Lions. They did take Frank Ragnow in the first round of that draft. Worked out okay. Who did you have them going with in the redraft?
This is where I had Nick Chubb going. I mean, I think it would have been a great fit. LeGarrette Blount was started 2018 as the Lions starting running back. That was also his last season in the NFL. Kerryon Johnson, who they drafted in this draft, ended up leading that team in rushing in 2018, who I liked Kerryon Johnson coming out, but he was still what he is. To get Nick Chubb there, I think would have been big for this offense, even though, Matthew Stafford's still there. It's not going in the right direction necessarily in terms of, all right, we're building up to another playoff run with this team. But I think that maybe you add a Nick Chubb in this offense and that changes things.
Yeah, the Kerryon Johnson part of it just makes this so easy. Like we know they wanted a running back in this draft. Kerryon Johnson ended up going like 10 or 12 picks after Nick Chubb in the second round. So dropping Nick Chubb in here and just with that offensive line they had started to build at this point, I think that's a really fun one. I think you could also make a case for Jair here. They probably could have used another outside corner. And again, Jesse Bates is still on the board for me, but they had Glover Quinn and Quandre Diggs. And so I think that going a slightly different direction and picking Chubb at a position of need, that one tracks to me. The Cincinnati Bengals at 21. They actually took Billy Price. This was during that I don't even know what that correct adjective is here. Just the wilderness time for the Cincinnati Bengals draft history. Who did you have them going with in the redraft?
Yeah, Billy Price was supposed to be he's got he might not have a high ceiling, but he's got a high floor. He's a can't miss type of guy. And obviously that didn't work out. I went with Derwin James.
He got them BJ Hill. That was worth it. They eventually got to trade him for BJ Hill.
I went with Derwin James, who, we know they're going to lose out on Jesse Bates in the second round. Jesse Bates already off the board in my scenario. So James, really, besides 2019 and 2020 when he was hurt, he's been pretty good. And so maybe the highs aren't always there, but Derwin James still belongs in this first round, I think.
I absolutely agree. Obviously, I had him going a few picks before this. I had Mike McGlinchey going here, and again, it's for this reason. Similar to the right tackle situation for the Chargers in those years, with me wanting to rectify it, I remember the Bobby Hart days for the Cincinnati Bengals. This was post Cedric Abui Jake Fisher times for the Bengals,
Yep.
and so they were trying to piece together their offensive line situation. They traded for Cordy Glenn before this season, which is what
Yeah.
allowed the Bills to move up in this draft, but they still had a big glaring hole at right tackle. So Mike McGlinchey has been more than serviceable in that spot, and so having a capable right tackle for those Bengals teams, very tempting for me to do here because I remember the experience of watching those teams.
Poor Bobby Hart, just going out there trying his best, and it was rough. It was so bad, but yeah, that really led to the emphasis on offensive line for the Bengals. There's these years right here, so that makes total sense. Good McGlinchey there.
22, the Tennessee Titans. They draft Rashaan Evans in the actual draft. Who did you have them going with here?
Rashaan Evans, another one. Jeez. I went with Calvin Ridley. Just get to Tennessee a little bit earlier. Corey Davis, he was their wide receiver 1 on that team. And then after that, the receiver depth chart just dropped off in a major way. And so Mariota's still the starter then. Obviously that did not work out, but he also didn't really have anybody to throw to. And so Calvin Ridley kind of tried to help change that.
I don't think this is wrong, but again, the A.J. Brown part of it, I was like, I don't really know if I want to mess with that. I know A.J. Brown is coming down the road.
Right.
I went with Tremaine Edmonds, and again, it was one of those where it's an easy one-for-one swap. They drafted an all-ball linebacker. They clearly wanted one. There's some corners, like Jair is still available for me here, but they were pretty heavily invested at corner at that point. They had Malcolm Butler, Logan Ryan, and Adoree Jackson on that team. And then even at safety, Jesse Bates has not been taken from me yet. They had some safeties on that team. Kevin Byard was there. And so it was easy because I knew they wanted Rashaan Evans for me to just drop Tremaine Edmonds into this spot. 23, the New England Patriots. They drafted Isaiah Wynn in the first round. Who'd you have them going with in the redraft?
I had them going with Courtland Sutton. Brady's last 2 years, 18, 19 in New England, those receiver situations were so bad. Julian Edelman was there. But besides Edelman, it was rough. Looking at the 2018 Patriots, do you know who actually led that team in targets? It's James White. He had 123.
It was one of the running backs. I couldn't remember which running back it was because I literally looked up the same thing this morning.
123 targets that year. Obviously Gronk is still on those teams, but to add another weapon on the outside, like a Courtland Sutton, maybe you're getting, and those Patriots teams are still like 11-win teams, but still to add another weapon on the outside, maybe you're getting a little bit more out of those teams than what they actually did.
So we're on a very similar page here. I had them doing this at 31, where they drafted Sony Michel. I had them drafting Courtland Sutton for pretty much the same set of reasons. Remember, they went to get Josh Gordon, and so they wanted a big body receiver on those teams. And so giving them Courtland Sutton based on the other decisions they made, that was pretty easy for me. But I did that a little bit later on. Another player who was hard to place here, just because he's clearly been valued really highly by the league. When he's healthy, he's a really good player. It's just been a question of health. I had them going with Bradley Chubb here.
Yep.
If you look at those teams, those Patriots teams in 2018 or so, Trey Flowers in the final year of his deal. Other than that, not a lot of high-end pass rushing talent on those teams. And so them taking the chance on Chubb this late, considering what he's been at his best, I think that one's justifiable to me.
Well, and Chubb's been a guy that he has a really good season and then it's an injury. Really good season, and it's been on, off. And so missing this past year, he's due for a big year in 2025. So we'll see if he can do it. So that makes, top 5 pick in this draft. When he's healthy, he absolutely belongs in this first round. So I certainly understand that.
The Panthers at 24. They actually took DJ Moore. I think we both had the same guy going here. What did you do for the Panthers at 24?
Yeah, this is where Jair Alexander comes off the board. I think, that makes sense. Even though his end in Green Bay wasn't exactly what you would expect for a first-round pick, a guy that you extended, he's still a good cornerback, and maybe took a little bit of a discount to go to Baltimore. So we'll see how that plays out for the Ravens this year. But for Carolina, they needed some help at corner in 2018. So to get Jair Alexander here at 24, I think that fits.
Yeah, they drafted Dante Jackson in that same draft. and
That's
they
right.
already
Yeah.
had James Bradbury. So that
Yep.
again, that one makes it easy. We knew they wanted a corner, which I hear on the board. I penciled that one in very quickly. The Ravens at 25. In the actual draft, they took Hayden Hurst, 7 picks before they took Lamar Jackson, which is always very funny to think about. Who
No.
did you have them going with in the redraft in Baltimore?
Hayden Hurst will always be the trivia answer. Yeah, so I went with Sam Darnold here. And it's fascinating to think about with a better situation. He would have sat in 2018, at least to start, behind Joe Flacco. 2018 was Flacco's last year in Baltimore. Um, so the opportunity, because Sam Darnold was a redshirt sophomore when he came out. He was still a very young player. So to get that ability to come along at your own pace, Marty Morningweg was the offensive coordinator back then. Like I don't know how that would have worked out, but I understand at least taking that swing at that point. So if things would have played out the way they should have, Lamar Jackson would have went early, Sam Darnold went a little bit later. That trajectory for Darnold in a situation like Baltimore is fascinating to think about.
Yeah, I had him going at 32. So
Yeah.
we're on the exact same page here. And again, trying to figure out what to do with Sam Darnold in this exercise, the fact that the Ravens did take a quarterback and had 2 picks at the end of this draft, it was easy. It's like, okay, this is where he probably should go in an exercise like this. You change the situation. He goes behind the quarterbacks who've been more successful and consistent than he's been. So I totally understand this, and I did it 7 picks later. So we did the same thing with Cortland Sutton and Sam Darnold, where we both had them going to those respective teams just with their second picks in the first round.
Yeah, that makes sense.
26, I actually had Braden Smith going here to the Ravens.
Oh.
Again, they had drafted Orlando Brown in the 3rd round, so they needed a right tackle, and Braden Smith has been really solid for the Colts for most of his career. So that one was another one where it was like, you know what? I knew they wanted a guy at that spot. Give them another starting caliber player here, and we'll get the quarterback at 32 the same way they did in the real draft.
That's the first guy in my draft that I don't have, or I don't have in my draft that you had in yours, is Braden Smith.
Yeah, you had the tackles, though, that group pushed a little bit lower. I had McGlinchey going earlier, and so that's why I had Braden Smith going. Atlanta at 26. In the actual draft, they take Calvin Ridley. What'd you have them doing in the redraft?
I'm going Bradley Chubb. So a couple picks after where you had Chubb going. This is where I have him going. Again, productive when healthy. And, we've talked about the Falcons pass rush situation ad nauseum the last 10 years and how they've just struggled to find that upgrade. Vic Beasley was still on that 2018 team, but I think he lost a starting job that year. Tack McKinley, they drafted him in the first round the year before. That didn't work out, and that was pretty apparent early on. So to get Bradley Chubb at this point gives them a little bit of that pass rush juice they've been missing.
Yeah, I mean, they're still trying to find it. They spent this entire offseason still trying to find it. Bradley Chubb is off the board for me here. I went with Jesse Bates. This is one where he probably could go 5 times before I had him going. I think there was always a reason why I picked somebody else. Even like with the Bengals at 21, I wasn't going to put him on this Bengals team because they didn't want him. He was there for the rookie contract, then he left. So I didn't want to do that again. And so the fact that he's currently on the Falcons and that Falcons team had Ricardo Allen and DeMonte Casey as its safeties, like that was easy for me. And then a fun one because, again, we have seen him in that spot already. And so with Jesse Bates still on the board, he was clearly the best player available, and I do think he makes sense there. The Seahawks at 27. Who you got?
This is where I had Mark Andrews coming off the board.
This is good. I like that.
Yeah, it's a good fit with Russell Wilson at the time. You look at the tight end depth chart, Nick Vannett, Will Dissly, Ed Dixon. I mean, a guy like Mark Andrews could have really elevated that position and what he would have meant for that offense. So I think that's a great fit there.
Yeah, I like that one a lot. I had Carlton Davis going here. They actually took Rashad Penny in the 2018 draft, but Trey Flowers started most of that season for the Seahawks. Richard Sherman had just moved on. They had Shaq Griffin, but this was in that time where they were really searching for some answers at corner, and Carlton Davis has been a very good player. And the fact that Carlton Davis is still getting paid $20 million a year, even though we're on team number 3, I think speaks to what kind of player he still is at this point in his career. So he was one of those guys that pretty easy, no-brainer first rounder for me.
Well, that's exactly why I had him going next pick at 28 to the Steelers. I mean, already Burns was a bust early on for the Steelers. They needed some help at corner. Joe Hayden was a fine stopgap option for them, but add in a Carlton Davis. That everything you just said, just copy and paste for the Steelers at 28.
I had Shaq Leonard going here. He was another one of those guys. I just wasn't sure what to do with him. Because obviously the highs were incredibly high. He was one of the best players in the league at his position for multiple years. So what do you do with that, even though he's out of the league at this point when a lot of these other guys are still productive? I just look at the depth chart at linebacker for where the Steelers were at that point. Again, it was very much in flux. They had Jonathan Bostic there as a one-year starter in 2018. And so even if you're not getting a very long ride with Shaq Leonard, I think that his peak over those 3 or 4 years still, to me, you can make an argument for why he belongs in the first round.
Shaq Leonard, he's kind of almost in the same conversation as Van Der Esch, right? Where it's like, okay, this is a really good player. It just robbed by injuries. And with the Steelers, I think that you look at, and maybe an offshoot of this too is it prevents the Devin Bush trade up a year later, right?
That's right. I didn't even think about that part of it.
Yeah, that 2019 where they traded it up in the first round, get a 10 overall, 20-10 to get Devin Bush. So, yeah, you're also not only getting a good player here, you're preventing a future mistake a year later. I like that.
This is a really hard one, but because you only get, you get 4 seasons out of Shaq Leonard, but he was first team All-Pro 3 of those seasons, and he was second team in the 4th year. So it's like, I just don't know exactly what to do with that, but it's just so tempting for the peak and where the Steelers team was at that point. They were super competitive, and I didn't even think about the Devin Bush trade part of it. So, yeah, I feel good about this one, even if you're only getting a few years out of Shaq Leonard if his career played out the same way. The Jacksonville Jaguars at 29. This one's an easy one because they took Taven Bryan in the first round, so anything they do is probably going to be an improvement on what they ultimately did in real life. What are you doing with the Jags at 29?
I had him sticking with the same position, going Daron Payne, who has been a good player, maybe not a great player, but a solid to good player for the majority of his career in Washington. And so Jaguars, with what didn't work out with Taven Bryan, I think Daron Payne kind of fixes that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good one. I had Calvin Ridley going here. Again, it's fun that he eventually did end up on the Jaguars.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to read you the 3 leading target getters on the 2018 Jaguars in a post-Allen Robinson world. D.D. Westbrook, Dante Moncrief, and Keelan Cole.
Wow.
I think Calvin Ridley probably could have earned some targets on that 2018 Jaguars team.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's funny that I had Calvin Ridley going to the Titans at 22. You had him going 29 to the Jaguars. So we're just, we're getting Tim to his teams a little bit earlier.
30, the Minnesota Vikings. They took Mike Hughes in the actual draft. Who did you have them going with in the redraft?
I had him going Wyatt Teller. The Vikings, they were rolling out Mike Remmers and Tom Compton at their starting guards in 2018. I think Tom Compton did my taxes two months ago. It wasn't a good group. And so add Wyatt Teller in there. And I know with Teller, it wasn't like a immediate hit. It wasn't like he from the get-go, he was being a Pro Bowl level player. Took a few years, but still, I think at the end of the first round like this, to upgrade your interior, even if you have to be a little bit patient, I like that pick for Minnesota.
I like this one because this is another team that they've been trying to fix the interior of their offensive line in perpetuity. And so trying to get ahead of it a little bit, I do like that. I did something here with the Vikings that we've done a few times. They took an outside corner in this draft. I just gave them another one. I put DJ Reed here. And DJ Reed is another one of those players, kind of similar to Wyatt Teller. It came along a little bit slower. It wasn't an immediate hit, but ended up becoming a really good player and is still getting paid, not at the top of the market, but like a top 10 corner based on the play that he, put on the field over the last couple of years. It got rewarded by the Lions, I think, in a way that made sense. So them getting another corner here. The other guy I would throw out that I was tempted to throw into the first round was Taron Johnson. So Mackenzie Alexander was the slot corner on those teams. And so putting Taron Johnson on those Vikings teams instead of Mackenzie Alexander, I think that one also makes some sense.
Well, and it's funny you said that because with the next pick at 31 with the Patriots, there were 4 players I was trying because I knew I was going at 32 into Baltimore. So 31, it came down to 4 players for me. DJ Reed and Tron Johnson were 2 of those guys. And then the other one, Poona Ford, and the other one was Zach Seiler. So between those 4 players, I was trying to decide who I wanted to go with the Patriots. I ended up going Zach Seiler. Just seemed like a Patriots type of guy.
He really is.
Just a great story, obviously, where he came from, being a walk-on and being drafted late, and then I believe he was cut. Like, I mean, he's just everything that happened with his trajectory is not the normal way, but he's made it through, and when he's healthy, he's been outstanding for Miami. So I went Zach Sadler there at 31, but Poona Ford, DJ Reed, Teron Johnson were 3 names that I kind of wrote down for that spot.
Yeah, I think that Sauer makes a lot of sense. He's one of the 2 guys. Him and Wyatt Teller are probably the guys that pain me the most to not put in my first round.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that you snuck both of them in there, I like that. I already mentioned I had Cortland Sutton going here. And then at 32, I had Sam Darnold going there. You had him going at 25 to the Ravens. Who did you have the Baltimore Ravens taking with the 32nd pick?
I had him going Mike McGlinchey, a guy that you had off the board a little bit earlier, probably a little bit further than, even though I don't think he's necessarily lived up to being a top 10 pick or lived up to the contract that the Broncos gave him, but he's still an offensive tackle who is a more than serviceable starter. And so, we know Baltimore, they drafted Orlando Brown Jr. in this draft a little bit later, so they're going to miss out on him. You come back at 32, get him. So, yeah, Darnold, McGlinchey, you went offensive line. You went Braden Smith, right? At 25.
So same kind of deal. Yeah, we just flipped
exactly.
them.
Yep, exactly. We had the same thought process there.
All right. So that's it. I'm sure it pains Ravens fans, the fact that they have to come out of the 2018 draft without Lamar Jackson. And same for Bills fans, the fact that they'll leave an exercise like this without Josh Allen. These are timelines that neither of those fan bases has any interest in exploring.
Well, you think about the Ravens. They lost, at least 3 guys, because they lost Lamar Jackson, Orlando Brown Jr., Mark Andrews. So I think so. Three of their actual draft picks from that draft got drafted in this first round. The Browns had 3 with Baker Mayfield, Denzel Ward, Nick Chubb.
Yep,
that's interesting. I don't think any. I think just those 2 had 3. I don't think any other team had more than that. But 49ers obviously did well for themselves with Fred Warner, Mike McGlinchey. Yeah, that's interesting to look back.
The Bucs had Vita Vea and Carlton Davis. Yeah, so there were a few teams that had 2. And then for me, the Colts had 3 for me. I had Quentin Nelson, Braden Smith, and Shaq Leonard.
The Eagles getting Mailata and Josh Sweat late in the draft, kind of an all-timer for Howie there. That put him on the right path.
I mean, that was kind of the stretch where they were hitting more in the middle rounds than they were hitting on their first round picks for a little while. Obviously, things have changed for the Eagles over the last couple of years, but yeah, it's a fascinating exercise. I'm glad we did it. Again, I've never done it before, but fun to stroll down memory lane a little bit here with you, buddy. So glad to get you back on the show. I hope you're enjoying your break, and we're going to be getting to 2026 draft talk here before we know it.
I can't wait. We got a lot of things planned, and so it's exciting.
We do have a lot of fun stuff planned. Can't tell you everything right now, but there is some fun stuff on the horizon on the Athletic Football Show as far as our draft coverage is concerned. So be on the lookout for that. I'm sure we'll be talking about it very soon. For now, that's all we got. Appreciate you guys listening. Me and Derek will be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching the Athletic Football Show. Subscribe to the channel to keep up with us. Like and comment on this video, and we'll see you next time.